So welcome to part 5 of the Balance of World Order. I'm basically just finishing up this article, and then I'll be getting to the Nannygate research and the subprime research. And then I will be hitting up, um, so Elon Musk and conservatives in the past have been saying that federally there's just illegal immigrants to mass vote, but it's not true. But although it's not good, there are local places that allow undocumented immigrants to vote. And so the local vote is probably one of the most important things just for you and your community. It can have an effect in the federal, but I'm just saying it's not on the level of the federal, but it's still a problem. And people having their rights taken away from the local vote by undocumented people because they don't want they don't care about your opinion, you know. So, and then I'll be getting to uh, what is Project 2025, which I think we all know. I think the Birth Earth pretty much pointed out a bunch of culture wars for its reasoning for why the country is declining, and the culture war topics needed to be removed. And in my opinion, at least anecdotally speaking, apparently, it started with stripping our time management, with uh, allowing us to be put into the position of nannies. And then it was stripping Roe away from us so people couldn't get abortions. Now, I think people in society at large are put into the position to need abortions and contraception instead of just, you know, I'm sure there's other methods instead of just uh, criminals being put back out on the street and such like that. So I do think there's an issue where at this point, now that abortion is like a Roe is overturned, along with the Chevron ruling, immunity to all corporations basically, they can do any unregulated activity at this point. Like they could already flood the oceans if they want. All right, just a quick rant there, guys. Now I'm getting back to it. Reproductive value. Respondents also reported spending the time they purchased on satisfying their own social reproductive needs. Both female and male interviewees said that they outsource social reproduction to gain more time together with their children and their partner. Thus, as Hochschild has shown that dual earner families suffer from a speed up of work and family life. Our data demonstrates that participants outsource social reproduction to decelerate the pace by inserting additional time into everyday life. Respondents then maximize the time available for both wage labor and quality time with their children, which, according to the ideologies of intensive parenting, is detached from devalued cleaning tasks. While many participants mentioned the importance of leisure and uh, recreation time, they commonly constructed such free time as something they needed in order to reproduce labor power. They described how their work consumes them and how outsourcing social reproduction allows them to gain what they have lost during the weekday. As Susanna, an employer of part-time domestic worker, remarked, quote, with a fairly minimal output, you can preserve yourself. Consequently, it becomes possible to discern a type of reproductive value embedded in outsourcing social reproduction, which is linked to both the deceleration of time and to the production of labor power. These developments relate to Hochschild's analysis of the growing importance of the cultural world of work. Work offers feelings of belonging that were previously attached to the social worlds of families and local communities. Paid employment is constructed as a meaningful and valuable way of contributing to society. Both female and male respondents described their work ambitions coupled with the irregular hours of work as one of the main reasons for outsourcing. The construction of paid employment as valuable as connected to class and gender. Several female participants said that uh, oh, sorry, said they desire something more of a life than being at home with their children on a full-time basis. According to them, paid employment provides them with meaningful activity that allows them to be better mothers to their children and remain sane, which they stressed is beneficial for their children. While none of the male participants justified their decisions for outsourcing by emphasizing their fatherhood, many said it offers them more time together with their children. Concurrently, highly remunerated specialist positions are organized around the assumption that another person is at home caring for the family's reproductive needs, a task traditionally handled by women. Women can now assume such positions due to changing gender roles. But it's still felt in the background when these, like, men don't, like, as they say, they don't really position themselves through their fatherhood with their problems, I guess, with their and how they emphasize the stress. So I assume it's just based on, like, the myth of the mother instinct, and men can easily opt out of this because they're not convinced of this generationally. So some women who employed nannies described how they would have stayed on parental leave for a longer time had they not hired a nanny, since they perceived combining employment with public child care centers as increasingly difficult. They criticized the public child care centers' lack of resources and expressed a certain reluctance to place their small children in a public daycare. Hence, the political economy of care is interrelated with class and cultural understandings of quality care. Participants often combined public child care with private care and regarded private child care as an additional expense they paid to provide their children with quality care and emotional value. However, what emerged as crucial for the participants was the inability of the public sector child care centers to meet the demands of the changing work life. Paula, an executive level employee at a major company, described her attempts to combine care responsibility with work prior to hiring AU pairs. We observed that this is not possible. One needs to be able to live. It is not possible to be an achievement every day so that one feels that, wow, yeah, I made it through this day. According to Paula, her everyday life before employing an AU pair was an achievement in the sense that she was able to combine work and child care. Her children attended two different public child care centers that closed at a certain hour. This placed additional time constraints on her and her husband, both of whom worked full-time and needed to be at their offices for 8 hours, and then picked up their children before the center closed. Both Paula and her husband were working full-time, which, as the above quote shows, created stress that spilled over into their free time. The quote demonstrates how the intensification of work impacts the day-to-day micro-mobilities around care, as the interviewees reported a lack of time for access movements, and therefore hired nannies to take care of such activities. The gender division of domestic labor is one of the main analytical categories applied to previous research to explain outsourcing of social reproduction. Gunnalan's studies have linked gender to an assertion of class difference between the domestic workers and female employers, organized around the construction of domestic work as dirty work beneath the status of female employers. Yeah, I mean, there are things that nobody wants to do, and we all recognize this, but these things have always been needing to get done, and I guess that's why we had slavery, and now we have, like, legal nannies with the paperwork and the visas, so I'll get to that. Anyways, our findings from the Finnish context differ in part from such outcomes. The participants' attitude regarding social reproduction was constructed around pragmatism, and they described domestic work as work they lacked the time for rather than as work they despised. Our data indicates that outsourcing social reproduction is less an outcome of men's reluctance to engage in domestic work or the construction of domestic work as dirty, and more a result of the increasing demand of work and capital. Moreover, the practice of outsourcing domestic work is also connected to the reproduction of middle-class households being conflated with the idea of cleanliness, orderliness, and well-adjusted children. Yet, although most female and male employers reported construct social reproductive tasks pragmatically as a shared responsibility, reproductive labor continues to be a gendered work to some extent. Many female participants describe themselves as the project managers of the household, responsible for organizing unpaid reproductive labor. Approximately half of the men interviewed said that they aim to share such reproductive labor with their partners, while half described doing more unpaid domestic reproduction. Okay, so participant, as in it's like a bluff that they're gonna try and put more of their male energy into the home tasks. Like maybe, but I doubt it. So where was I? Oh, um, only one woman said that the reproductive labor was her sole responsibility. Of that male participants in relationships, of the male participants in relationships, 3 said they shared reproductive tasks but recognized that their wives did a bit more. Relatedly, the majority of the women interviewed stated that they oversaw the administrative tasks concerning employment, researching options and finding suitable candidates, and arranging documents for residence permits. 3 of the male participants said they oversaw the administrative task, while 2 said their wives' responsibility said it was the real. Yeah, of course they did. So this is literally like the male saying he's gonna babysit the kid. It's his kid, okay? But he would fight for it in like if he didn't want to be cucked, but it's still babysitting if it's his kid. That's insane. Jesus Christ. Okay. In most instances, the wife had a closer relationship with the employee AU pair. Most of the women had been on parental leave after their children were born, while their husbands continued working. 6 women said that they both had their husbands had taken parental leave, albeit their husbands for shorter periods of time. 2 of the male participants said that they had taken parental leave. Moreover, 2 single women employed a nanny to substitute for the absent fathers unwilling to participate in care work. Of course, like all they could do is pitch in. Jeez, this indicates how the valuation of time is gendered, as women spend more time on devalued reproduction, while men spend greater amounts of time in a more highly regarded productive sphere. This article contributes to research on outsourcing by focusing attention on 2 dimensions that have previously received less attention. First, we have pointed to a devaluation of time constructed in relation to outsourcing social reproduction. Employers of domestic workers constructed outsourcing as a means to purchase the commodity time, which is simultaneously devalued and revalued. Hiring migrant domestic workers devalues the price required to purchase the time commodity. Time is, however, also revalued, as the employers of domestic workers tend to convert this time commodity into reproductive labor time or a second shift in their paid employments performed in the evenings. Employers of domestic workers may also revalue the purchased time as a free time that is nevertheless spent on their self-reproduction as workers. The focus on the revalue of time extends the analysis beyond the existing focus on outsourcing as valuable for employers of domestic workers to examine the values that such outsourcing may enable employers of domestic workers to produce. Second, we have approached employers of domestic workers as the workers who struggle within time to meet the demands of increasing productive labor time. How these upper, middle, and middle-class workers organize their social reproduction thus depends on the complex process of valuation of time, labor, and capital. The increasing demand of capital and labor organizes the demand for social reproduction. Employers of domestic workers meet growing demands to engage in reproductive labor time. Simultaneously, commodified labor time is deemed more valuable than the time required for unpaid social reproduction, both by the participants in the research and by society at large. Through a focus on the valuation of time, we demonstrate that the diverse links between the employment of care and domestic workers and the logic of capital, and point to the connection between migrant domestic workers, labor power, and the labor time and labor power of the employers of domestic workers. Marxist value analysis generally perceives buying services as a depletion of capital, since domestic workers' salaries are paid out of employers' own salaries. Nevertheless, we propose that outsourcing is perceived as an investment in traditional human capital and surplus value production. Hence, to properly analyze the outsourcing of domestic work and potentially change the global inequalities around outsourcing, we need to take questions of accumulation seriously in contemporary capitalism. Alright. So, I feel like this is only getting worse, obviously. I think I say that a lot. Jesus Christ. It's hard to stay positive, to be real. Because I just think of, like, how my mom struggled to raise me. Like, she was always doing so much. Like, I never really did anything until, like, my 20s, I think. I think I mowed the lawn sometimes, but just, I don't know. It was simpler times. We weren't in a dire panic. And I guess I'm just, older now and I realize things, I guess. But it's just, I really hate that I was just so unwilling to, like, pitch in. For real. Alright. Nannygate. So, this could be a bit of a dog whistle for some people, but, alright, hold on. Alright. Sorry, I had to spin my chair towards the window to get that light. I think the tree light is fine, right, guys? At least that's how I would see it. Alright, so, Nannygate. So, Nannygate is a popular term for the 1993 revelation that caused two of President Bill Clinton's choices for United States Attorney General to become derailed. In January 1993, Clinton's nomination of corporate lawyer Joe Bard for the position came under attack after it became known that she and her husband had broken federal law by employing two people who had immigrated illegally from Peru as a nanny and chauffeur from their young child. They had also failed to pay Social Security taxes for the workers, the so-called nanny tax, until it shortly before the disclosures. While the Clinton administration thought the matter was relatively unimportant, the news elicited a firestorm of public opinion, most of it against Bard. Within 8 days, her nomination lost political support in the U.S. Congress and was withdrawn. So, it's possible that we were always using nannies like this. It's just people pointed at a woman in the administration, and they just... I mean, the family in general, I guess, is... Oh, no, it's talking about her. So, yeah. It does feel a little biased here that, like, you have all this corporate power and hush-hush money until it's a woman that does it, and so it becomes more, like, malleable for the rumor to get out or something. I don't know. So, I think it's interesting that this happened in the 90s, and it's an immigrant from Peru, so I'm gonna bring this up in a different video for sure, but around this time, there was a sterilization campaign that I believe America was in on. So, yeah, this would be ironic if we're just United States aid is just funding sterilization campaigns in Peru, and then we're stealing some for the brain gain over here. That would be sick, honestly. So, alright. The following month, Clinton's choice of federal judge, Kimba Wood, for the job was leaked to the press, but within a day it became known that she too had employed someone who had immigrated illegally to look after her child. Although Wood had done so at a time when such hiring was legal and had paid Social Security taxes for the worker, the disclosures were enough to cause the immediate withdrawal of Wood from the consideration. The Clinton administration then said that the hiring practices for households help would be examined for all of the more than 1,000 presidential appointments under consideration, causing the whole process to slow down significantly. Determined to choose a woman for the Attorney General post, Clinton finally selected State Prosecutor Janet Reno, who was confirmed and served through all 8 years of the administration. The Nannygate matter caused wealthy Americans to ask each other if they too had a Zoe Bard problem, as the hiring of illegal aliens and the paying of household help off the books were both commonplace. Two fault lines, gender and class, were exposed in the discussion over Nannygate. In the former, a double standard were seen where female appointees faced a greater risk of being questioned and disqualified based on their child care arrangements, while in the latter, affluent professional women who could afford live-in child care arrangements were seen as trying to get away with an illegal act. Nannygate-type controversies have subsequently affected other political appointees, both in the U.S. and in other countries. So, we get the general idea here. So, in my opinion, even with the visas and all the legal information, and so you're not illegal, I still would see this as a Nannygate scenario because of the time, labor issue that we face in our countries as work becomes more hectic and there's no time to really clean the house and raise the children at the same time. So this issue becomes almost like a necessity, or sorry, not an issue, but I do think it's a little unfortunate, that we can't do it ourselves. It's almost sort of a legal type of slavery, but I mean, I'm sure they get paid fine to their standards, right? Even though that could mean, like, literally nothing compared to us. But, jeez. So, I could see how this is like a 50-50 scenario where they do sort of allow us to be put into the position to be replaced in certain circumstances. And so, all the scapegoating just goes to the immigrants and not the people who are hiring them. And so we basically get this whole, like, great replacement rhetoric. Even though it's like we could simply allocate time better, but that might not be so simple. Alright. So, heading to the subprime mortgage crisis. Alright. So, sorry about this, guys. Probably should have had this pulled already, but, if you're here watching, that's cool too. Alright. So, I'm gonna move myself up here. Alright. The recent housing foreclosure crisis was a key feature of the Great Recession. The rapid growth of subprime lending and concomitant rise of foreclosures adversely affected the economy and millions of homeowners. African Americans and Hispanic borrowers were disproportionately likely to receive subprime loans and to lose their homes to foreclosure. Existing evidence, though limited, suggests that residential segregation by race created distinct geographical markets that allowed subprime lending practices to flourish. However, past studies have not explicitly tested whether the concentration of subprime loans in minority neighborhoods varied by segregation levels. In the study described in this article, we will fill in this research gap by integrating neighborhood-level data and measures of residential segregation to examine the relationship between segregation and subprime lending across the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. Our research questions include across metropolitan areas where subprime loans were concentrated in minority neighborhoods in the largest segregated metropolitan areas than in less segregated metropolitan areas. Does the relationship between segregation and the concentration of subprime loans in minority neighborhoods vary if the neighborhoods are clustered together or scattered through the metropolitan area? Do subprime lending rates in minority neighborhoods vary between highly segregated, less segregated, and less segregated metropolitan areas after accounting for neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics? Prior research on segregation and housing crisis. In their 1993 book, American Apartheid, Douglas Massey and Nancy A. Denton detailed the history and continuing effects of racial residential segregation in the United States. The author writes that segregation began with the Great Migration after World War I, when large numbers of African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West to meet the need for labor generated by increasing industrialization. As working-class neighborhoods swelled, the black whites moved to new neighborhoods, leaving room for more black residents to move into the neighborhoods whites had left. As white residents found their housing options became more limited, they used neighborhood associations, racially restrictive covenants, and violence to prevent blacks from moving into their neighborhoods. In addition, the set of lending policies as redlining identified neighborhoods with minority residents. Lenders would not lend money for the purchase of homes in red-line neighborhoods, and realtors would not show properties in those neighborhoods to white prospective homeowners. Ultimately, middle-class whites fled to the suburbs, leaving blacks as the minority residents of many urban neighborhoods. Though still very restricted in their housing options, whilst white suburban homeowners built wealth through home equity, black families did not, contributing to large wealth gaps between blacks and whites. Although the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made practices like racially restrictive covenants and redlining illegal, subsequent studies have shown that 1. Whites still prefer to live in neighborhoods that are mostly white. 2. Lenders are more likely to deny loans to black and Hispanic homeowners that they are too equally qualified whites. And 3. That discrimination against both black and Hispanics in the housing market still exists. Although residential segregation peaked in the 1960s and had generally declined since, levels remain. Subprime loans, once relatively uncommon, accounted for only 8% of U.S. housing loans in 2003, constituted one-fifth of all U.S. housing loans in 2005 and 2006, with much higher rates of subprime lending in some areas. This subprime lending boom brought with it new ways for racial residential segregation to have disproportionately negative effects on minorities. Some blacks and Hispanics had lower home ownership rates than whites and limited access to and information on other lending options. Areas with high concentration of minorities likely provided a ready market for subprime loans, as residents had limited access to other lending options. Many studies have shown that blacks and Hispanics disproportionately received subprime loans and lost their homes due to foreclosure. For example, over the period of 2004 to 2008, African Americans and Hispanic borrowers were 1.6 times as likely as non-Hispanic white borrowers to receive a subprime loan. In addition, as of February 2012, 11% of African American borrowers and 14% of Hispanic borrowers had lost their homes due to foreclosure, compared to 6% of non-Hispanic whites. Some studies suggest that segregation played an important role in the housing crisis by providing an important opportunity for subprime lending and brokers to efficiently and effectively target minority neighborhoods, resulting in more subprime loans in segregated metropolitan areas. However, our study is the first to explicitly test this theory. Methods: we use census-tract neighborhood-level data on subprime loans and demographic characteristics for the 100 largest U.S. metropolitan areas, and we use Geographic Information Systems (GIS) software to determine the degree to which subprime loans were concentrated within metropolitan areas. We control for metropolitan-level factors that also influence the housing crisis, such as population and median household income, and percentage of residents who were Black and Hispanic. We also control for regional differences between housing markets and for real estate market conditions by including measures of overbuilding and housing price boom. Studies on segregation generally consider Black, white, and Hispanic white segregation separately, but in our analysis, we combine Blacks and Hispanics as a minority population in the West and Southwest neighborhoods. Alright. Hold on, sorry, just expanding the page a bit. So, neighborhoods that were particularly susceptible to subprime lending were more likely to be Hispanic than Blacks. In addition, as the Hispanic population has grown over the past 2 decades, Blacks and disadvantaged Hispanic increasingly live in the same or neighborhood area, providing larger potential markets for subprime lending. While we recognize that there are important differences between the experiences of Blacks and Hispanics in the housing crisis, we believe that combining the two groups for an analysis across a large number of metropolitan areas provides a more accurate portrait of vulnerable markets. So, I don't know if it should be combined, but I get I understand. It just seems like when it comes to people's fears of the birth dearth and changing demographics, it's usually immigrants, which unfortunately just translates to Hispanics or Mexican people. When it's like it's Africans or Cubans or so usually people aren't necessarily focused on African Americans, but there was a shooting that happened based on the Great Replacement and like Black people taking over. So I guess people are sort of talking about, or they are talking about Great Replacement and Black people sort of together like that, but usually it's immigrants. So it's a bit weird, but I understand why they would combine this information. Just to generalize, I guess. Alright. Measure of residential segregation. Evenness. The dissimilarity index measures the evenness between two groups of calculating the proportion of the group that would need to change residents in order for each neighborhood to have the same percentage of that group as the overall metropolitan area. This index will be high if individual neighborhoods have very difficult racial makeup than the metropolitan area as a whole. Exposure. The isolation index measures the extent to which members of the group are exposed to only other groups in that group by calculating the percentage of people in the group within a neighborhood for the average person in that group. This index will be high if most Blacks and Hispanics live in neighborhoods composed of mostly Blacks and Hispanics. Clustering. The clustering index measures the degree to which members of the group live near each other, forming contiguous geographic areas. This index will be high if Blacks and Hispanics tend to live in adjoining neighborhoods, rather than in neighborhoods scattered across a metropolitan area. To measure the degree of segregation in each metropolitan area, we use 3 indices. 1. A disciplinary index, which measures the evenness of racial groups within neighborhoods. An isolation index. Okay, I think I read that already. It's definitely smart and clever to use the census while talking about this. Seems kind of obvious, but I don't know how you could fake that. Alright, the relationship between segregation and subprime lending. Addressing each of our research questions in turn, we test whether minority neighborhoods in metropolitan areas with higher levels of segregation are particularly vulnerable to subprime lending. Across metropolitan areas, or subprime loans more concentrated in minority neighborhoods in highly segregated metropolitan areas than in less segregated metropolitan areas. Overall, as shown in Figure 1, we find that segregation does little to explain differences between metropolitan areas in the distribution of subprime loans between minority and non-minority neighborhoods. All three measures of segregation are positively but weakly associated with the share of metropolitan area subprime loans in minority neighborhoods. For example, one standard deviation increase in the isolation index increases the rate of subprime loans in minority neighborhoods by 2.8% points. These results are not surprising, given that one, metropolitan areas with high proportions of blacks and Hispanics have a large number of minority neighborhoods, and two, so yeah, so they're there anyways, but that doesn't really disprove the attempt at the racial predatory action against them. So yeah, I can see how this would be disproven, like, oh, it's mostly black people and Hispanics anyways, so what are you saying, it's racist? Yeah, I can see that rhetoric looming, I guess. These results are not finding, given that the okay, yeah. Oh, so I mean, it seems like they attack minority neighborhood clusters more. So, alright, shit. And two, minorities were more likely overall to receive subprime loans. Thus, the degree of subprime lending in minority neighborhoods is explained more by the proportion of black and Hispanic residents in a given metropolitan area than by patterns of racial segregation. Does the relationship between segregation and subprime loans in minority neighborhoods vary if the neighborhoods are clustered together or scattered through the metropolitan area? We find a very different result when we consider the extent to which subprime loans are clustered in clusters of minority neighborhoods, rather than spread throughout a metropolitan area. The large clusters of minority neighborhoods that segregation creates would provide markets. Sorry, I'm trying to my eyes are terrible. Provide markets to which lenders could efficiently target subprime loans. Therefore, rather than examining the proportion of a metropolitan area subprime loans within minority neighborhoods, as in the analysis described above, we examine the degree of correspondence between clusters of subprime loans and clusters of minority neighborhoods. Figure 1 also shows that when we take into account that whether minority neighborhoods are clustered together or scattered across the metropolitan area, we find more stronger effects of segregation or subprime loans compared to the first analysis, which looked only at the relationship between segregation and subprime loans lending in minority neighborhoods. We find that in more segregated metropolitan areas, subprime loans were disproportionately concentrated in minority clusters. For example, an increase in the isolation index by one standard deviation is associated with a 37.7 percentage point increase in the proportion of the subprime loan market that is within clusters of minority neighborhoods. This finding means that in highly segregated metropolitan areas, there tends to be high degrees of overlap between clusters of subprime loans and clusters of minority neighborhoods. This is illustrated in Figure 2, which shows that this overlap in the metropolitan area of Anaheim, Santa Ana, California. gray-filled tracts, clustered minority facets or tracts, stripe-filled tracts, clustered subprime lending. Oh. Wow. That's really messed up. Alright. The significance The significant findings for clusters are consistent with a process in which subprime loans were channeled to relatively large geographically concentrated minority areas, rather than simply targeting minority neighborhoods. However, it is still possible that minority neighborhoods may be the primary targets of subprime loans due to socioeconomic differences rather than racial differences. We address this possibility in the next section. Do subprime lending rates in minority neighborhoods vary between highly segregated and less segregated metropolitan areas after accounting for the neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics? In our third analysis, alright, just closing that. In our third analysis, we compare subprime lending patterns across neighborhoods, accounting for neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics. We find that while minority neighborhoods had subprime loan rates that averaged 14 percent points higher than non-minority neighborhoods. This difference is even higher in highly segregated metropolitan areas. For example, in a metropolitan area with a clustering index that is one standard deviation higher than another, the difference in the subprime lending rate between minority and non-minority neighborhoods would be an additional 3.2 percentage points. These results show that even after taking into account neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics, minority neighborhoods in highly segregated metropolitan areas were more likely to receive subprime loans than similar minority neighborhoods in a less segregated metropolitan area. Conclusions and policy implications. Prior research has identified segregation as a key factor in the housing crisis and has documented a relationship between segregation and a higher subprime loan and foreclosure rates at a metropolitan area or metropolitan level. These studies hypothesized that segregation created distinct geographic markets that enabled subprime lending and brokers to leverage the spatial complexity of minorities to disproportionately target minority neighborhoods. Our study is the first to test this hypothesis by examining whether the patterns of subprime lending within metropolitan areas differ across metropolitan areas with different levels of segregation. We find that metropolitan areas with high levels of segregation are more likely than segregated metropolitan areas to have had higher concentrations of subprime loans within clusters of minority neighborhoods. However, if we just consider the effect of segregation on the proportion of subprime loans in minority neighborhoods without looking at whether those neighborhoods are grouped together, we find a much weaker effect. This suggests that the larger clusters of minority neighborhoods may have provided markets to which subprime loans could be efficiently and effectively targeted. Residents of minority neighborhoods that are interspersed with more advantaged neighborhoods may be more likely than those living in large geographic areas of concentrated disadvantage to learn about and to be able to access mainstream lenders, or may be less easily targeted through strategies such as zip code based marketing. We also find that minority neighborhoods in metropolitan areas with higher levels of segregation have higher subprime lending rates than those in less segregated metropolitan areas, even when we consider the socioeconomic and housing characteristics of neighborhoods and metropolitan areas. Although the worst of the housing crisis is behind us, it likely has continuing effects on neighborhoods with large concentration of minority residents in highly concentrated metropolitan areas. The disparity in lending patterns will likely have enduring consequences on wealth accumulation for blacks and Hispanics and the trajectory of black and Hispanic neighborhoods that will last well into the future. So, no, actually, even to this day, we are facing hundreds of thousands of dollars to simply own your home. or more. It might be like $1 million to own a, or is that raising a child? I forget how like expensive. I'm pretty sure it's hundreds of thousands to actually of like own your home, and nobody can actually like really keep that in their bank account. Like we're living paycheck to paycheck, and the segregation housing crisis, I'm sure we're still feeling that, but just like how college was ruined, it's no longer about destroying the educated proletariat and like keeping black people out and minorities. It's all like indiscriminate at this point. Like things have been firebombed, even though there's a clear origin of segregation to it. So it's possible the tracks have been burned a little bit, besides where we can see money travel. Like everybody is feeling these effects of society and being financially harmed. So to anyone who isn't paying attention, like how can they say black and Hispanics have it rough when I'm also having it rough? But that's not the point. The point is that you aren't or are having it rough. That's not the point. I mean, they want your frustration, of course, to scapegoat and uh, advocate for the rage that they're hoping you speak out for. So this will be perpetuated, honestly. Although the worst of the housing, okay, although the greatly increased availability of home loans during the peak of subprime lending temporarily provided blacks and Hispanics with a path to home ownership and a way to build assets and wealth. The disproportionate concentrations and consequences of subprime loans in disadvantaged minority communities suggest that the housing crisis has only exacerbated racial and ethnic wealth inequality. Minority neighborhoods, especially those living in the segregated metropolitan area, are highly in need of attention. Possible interventions could including regulatory controls structured to prevent targeted predatory lending, increased financial education, and promoting mainstream financial institutions. The onus also falls on financial institutions to assist blacks and Hispanics in rebuilding credit and wealth in order to mitigate the increased inequality that resulted from the housing crisis. Finally, our results highlight the need to either decrease residential segregation or to provide increased opportunities and resources to those residing in minority neighborhoods in order to reduce the disproportionate effects of any future economic setbacks on minority neighborhoods. Policy effects such as zoning for mixed income housing and implementing regulations against housing discrimination could reduce social inequality and poverty. Social. Sorry, guys, gotta drink some water. So, it's not really everybody's fault that some millennials are living with their parents. So, as long as you work and you're paying some rent and you're doing like things around the house and you're not just letting your parents do it, so you're a good person. You deserve to live. You deserve to be brought in. But I do get a sense that these gender norms, the fact that it's things are so taken advantage of, take it for granted. Like you can't just live for free and not do anything. You have to get a job. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure like the fake like work ethic attitude that conservatives put off at sometimes when they're just like simping for the rich, it's really just it's so disgusting because there's some black and Hispanic conservatives, and I actually do see how hard they work, and it's just I feel lazy in comparison, and I'm a little inspired a little bit, but it is racially coded, unfortunately, that they are put into this work ethic for better or worse. But I also get that when I talk to one of my coworkers who is Hispanic, he talks about his homeland and such, and it's like he's still very like productive over there. So this isn't just like forcing minorities to do more work. I do believe it's taking advantage of their charity that they're willing to do. Okay. And that brings me to this a little bit. Um, so, this is a little disturbing. And like I said before, conservatives were saying that Democrats are stealing the election through the federal election by having illegal immigrants. But it's, you know, it's not as bad as that, honestly. Okay. Undocumented immigrants are allowed to vote in local elections in some municipalities. Undocumented immigrants and other non-citizens can't vote for federal or state offices, but they can vote for local offices in more than a dozen municipalities. Alright. Sorry. My eyesight. There won't be a nationwide federal election in 2023, but voters will still be able to cast ballots for local and state elections on this year's upcoming November 7 election. After we verified that federal law prohibits undocumented immigrants from voting in federal elections, some verified readers asked if they are allowed to vote in local elections. One viewer texted, "Can undocumented immigrants vote in local non-federal election?" The question, are undocumented allowed to vote in some local elections? The sources, U.S. Code, USA.gov, Ballotpedia, the Digital Encyclopedia. Okay, so I guess it's true. Yes, more than a dozen municipalities allowed undocumented immigrants to vote in some or all local elections. What we found, federal law does not prohibit non-citizens, including those who are undocumented and not authorized to legally live or work in the U.S., from voting in local or state elections. While no states grant undocumented immigrants the right to vote in state elections, more than a dozen municipalities nationwide allow undocumented immigrants to vote in local elections. U.S. Code makes it illegal for any non-citizen to vote for federal office, including for President, Vice President, the Senate, and House of Representatives. However, federal law specifies that non-citizens are allowed to vote for other offices if they're allowed to under a state constitution or status or a local ordinance. No state grants non-citizens the rights to vote in statewide elections, such as those for governor, according to USA.gov, but many state constitutions don't explicitly prohibit local governments from allowing non-citizens, including undocumented immigrants, to vote in local elections. Municipalities can expand voting rights to local elections if there are no explicit state constitutional or legislative impediments, and so long as local jurisdictions have the power of the home rule, wrote Joshua Douglas, an election and voting rights expert who teaches at the University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law, in a 2017 paper. Ballotpedia, a digital encyclopedia of American politics and elections, lists 17 municipalities that currently have laws allowing at least some non-citizens to vote in local elections. Non-citizens include people with legal authorization to live or work in the U.S., as well as people who are undocumented. Verify confirmed that the language of 13 of these municipalities' laws include undocumented immigrants among the non-citizens allowed to vote. Among immigrants among non-citizens. So what other non-citizens are allowed to vote? Like, that's so weird. So you can have other non-citizens who aren't immigrants, other people from like out of the country, vote in local elections. I think that might be what that's implying almost. Comment in the chat if you think I'm overanalyzing that. Oh my god. Okay. Alright. So verify confirmed that the language of 13 minutes. Okay. These municipalities include San Francisco and Oakland in California, Washington, D.C., and 10 communities in Maryland. All 10 of the Maryland communities are within the 10 counties that directly border Washington, D.C. Some of these municipalities, such as San Francisco and Oakland, only allowed their undocumented residents and other non-citizens to vote local school board elections. Oh, and only if there are parents or children attending the local school district. I guess that's what you could still anchor your child in and just do some. Okay, so I guess that's better than just being able to work there without any strings attached. So, um, that's interesting, honestly. Others, such as Washington, D.C., allowed non citizens to vote for office, such as mayor and council member, as well as referendums. Oakland's law directly franchises undocumented immigrants by defining non citizens as documented immigrants, lawful permanent residents, residents on work visas, and undocumented immigrants. Many of the other laws don't directly name undocumented immigrants, but extend the right to vote broadly enough to include them. For example, Chevy Chase Section 3 Maryland defines qualified voter as any person who is resident of Chevy Chase Section 3 without regard to citizenship and is at least 18 years of age. While the city doesn't allow them to vote in an election for city-wide offices, Chicago allows undocumented immigrants to vote in what is called the local school councils, which serves as the governing bodies for individual schools. Schools can also vote in these elections, of which there are 477 in the city. A few other cities nationwide allow non-citizen legal residents to vote, but non-undocumented immigrants. For example, Montpelier, Vermont, specifies a person must be a legal resident of the U.S. to register to vote. New York City was for a time among cities that allowed lawful permanent residents to vote, but did not extend the right to undocumented immigrants. However, the law has since been blocked by a state court. Many non-citizen voting laws, whether inclusive or inclusive of undocumented immigrants or strict to legal residents, face legal challenges upon their passage. The California Court of Appeals sided with San Francisco ages of legal challenge to stop its non-citizen voting law in August 2023, and Washington D.C. laws in the current and Washington's D.C. law is currently facing a challenge in court. Jeez, that's crazy. So you can almost see the paranoia that some people would like believe that they would slip into the federal election system, but I think that this is more a slap in the face to citizens who would get together to fight for better wages. But I bet you in these non-citizen voter areas, there's also like a ton of nannies too. Like also this non-citizen local thing, this local non-illegal immigrant thing is also probably a neoliberal strategy again because for the most part it doesn't want to like be responsible for people. I guess it could like be cheaper to have these people be in the system, and so they're just honestly screwing other people. So this could be places where there is a severe birth decline as well. That could also be a strange reason why politicians are doing this. So, alright. Either way, they don't want to pay you a fair wage. They never will at this point in time. Alright. And now,